This week on Dig Me Out.
It's just intellectually dishonest, like not a way, completely void of reality and facts.
Tim and Jay review at Action Park by Shellac.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Dig Me Out. I'm your host, Tim Minichi, and joining me once again, my co-host, Mr. Jason Ziak. Jay, it's episode 193, our fourth season of Dig Me Out, trudging ever so slowly towards number 200, our big bicentennial episode. And this week, as we have done recently, we're reviewing a band from the 90s who happen to have a new release out. In this case, it's not a front man putting out a solo release like we did previously with Whiskey Town and Soul Coughing. Their respective lead singers had solo albums out at the time. This week, it's a little bit different. We're doing it's a band putting out a new record, and they're called Shellac. Jay, are you familiar with the band called Shellac?
Yeah, I had the record. Don't remember when I bought it, but it's in my collection. So I was aware of it and I've listened to it prior to this assignment.
Do you have any other Shellac records? I'm curious.
No, just this one.
Just this one. Well, we're doing the first Shellac record. It's called At Action Park, which I learned in reading about this record is not a reference to the infamous New Jersey theme park called Action Park. Jay, do you know about that place?
No.
So there was a park. It was open for a couple decades. It's called Action Park. It closed in 96 because there were numerous fatalities. And basically this was like the park where you could do anything. So like they set up insane rides, and like if you wanted to ride a dirt bike through a flaming hoop, they would set it up and that would be the attraction. Like anything you could think of that was insane or dangerous, it was at Action Park.
Okay.
And then a lot of people died, and they decided to close it. I would suggest Googling Action Park and reading about it. There's a documentary about it as well.
Where was this at?
It was in New Jersey.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds like something I expect to see down here in Texas.
No, this is in the wilds of New Jersey.
Huh.
Yeah.
Never
I believe
heard
it
of
opened in the 70s. And, in the 70s, there weren't really a lot of laws. And it wasn't until, in the 80s when things like drinking ages and stuff like that, it was lawless, basically, up until the 80s. And
I know. Our first 4th of July down here in Texas, I was reminded of Ohio in the 70s. Just because there are basically no laws here for fireworks, and that's the way it was in Ohio in the 70s. But So it reminded me of being a little kid where it was just essentially for the whole day or two, just dangerous shit happening everywhere. People riding around and lighting things off and giant fires. And
so were you dressed like Jeremy Renner in the Hurt Locker in full gear in case any explosives went off around you?
There are moments when I felt like we probably should be.
Okay.
But in a weird way, it reminded me of being a kid and, riding around the back of a pickup while all this kind of craziness was going on.
Gotcha. Well, we should talk about some history of Shellac for those unaware.
History of the band.
The band formed in Chicago, Illinois in 1992. It was a collaboration between guitarist Steve Albini, who's also known as a producer and poker player, food blogger, various other things he does, and drummer Todd Traynor. They were originally joined by bassist Camilo Gonzalez from the band Naked Ray Gun. He plays on one song on Shellac's first single, and then Bob Weston, who was in a band called Volcano Suns, joined as the permanent bass player. A couple of interesting notes about, I'll get into the releases. First of all, The first album came out 2 years after they formed, 1994, at Action Park, which I mentioned is not actually related to the park itself. It was just something that the drummer Todd Traynor came up. He thought it was cool sounding. 3 years later, they released the album The Futurist, which was an instrumental album. It was recorded for the modern dance troupe La 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 Human Steps. They didn't particularly like the recording, so they didn't want it released to a wide audience. So they only produced about 779 copies of the record, and they, on the album cover, is the name of each person they were giving the album to, and they circled the name and gave the album to that person, so that if anybody ended up selling the record, they would know who did it because it had their copy was signed or was circled. In 1998, they released the album Terraform. In 2000, 1000 Hertz. There was a break between 2000 and 2007 when they released Excellent Italian Greyhound, and they have a new album out right now. It's called Dude Incredible, and it's not Dude, Incredible. It's Dude Incredible, like Major Awesome or Captain Sweet. I don't know, but Dude Incredible. That's the new record. So a couple of notes about Shellac. The sound of the band comes from the fact that they, Steve Albini has a enthusiasm for Travis Bean guitars, which are aluminum based. He also uses a specific guitar pedal called an Interfax harmonic percolator distortion pedal, which I've never heard of before. And then one other note is that, and I just found this funny, is that during many of their live performances, during the middle of the show, they'll often stop and do a question and answer period. So that's the history and some notes on Shellac.
That would seem to be a momentum killer.
It would seem to be, unless you're particularly funny.
Yeah.
So if you'd like to suggest if you would like to suggest an album for us to review, please visit our request review page at digmeoutpodcast.com. We got a couple pieces of Facebook feedback on this record. Sean Michael Foster says, a whole nother level of goodness in this record. Their first full length, definitely not an unsung gem. It's a classic. And Gavin Reed said, so glad someone requested this. I would have otherwise incredibly difficult band, but if you love them, if you see them live, you love them. Saw them last year. So that's our feedback. Those are our notes. Let's talk about what we liked and what we didn't like about this record. Jay, I'm going to throw it to you first. You were more familiar. I'd actually not listened. I mean, I had briefly streamed some Shellac a while back just to check them out. I had listened to some of Albini's earlier stuff with Big Black. I haven't listened to Rape Man, which is the band in between Big Black and Shellac. But I wasn't quite as familiar. So going back, Jay, and revisiting this, tell me what'd you like about this record?
I'm a fan of sometimes I'm a fan of the Travis Bean guitar sound. I don't know if you recognized it, but it's essentially the same sound that you hear on the Criteria records. Mm-hmm. Same guitar. I think it creates a very a guitar sound that lends itself to being rhythmic, almost like a percussion instrument. And I think what Shellac does that's most interesting to me is they combine that with a melodic bass, and it can create some pretty interesting results. So, like the openings track, it's a pretty cool riff, but it's very repetitive guitar-wise. But when the bass comes in, it plays this melody that it actually makes the riff sound like it's shifting and changing, but it's not. It's just choosing different bass notes. I just like that dynamic, so that the bass starts to pull you through the song, and the guitar is more of a rhythm instrument. which is a pretty cool dynamic. It kind of shifts up, I think, what we traditionally think of those two instruments doing, whereas guitar is providing more of a melodic sense that you're going to write a vocal around and sort of hold the melody of the song together, and then the bass and the drums are going to provide all the rhythm. So I just, that's one of the things that I really found interesting about the band. And when I was listening to them at the time, what I was listening to them for. So that's probably the biggest thing I like about them. How about you?
Well, for me, I think the thing that really struck me that I really enjoyed was how he's able to take that, what you mentioned with the Travis Bean guitar, and Criteria was the band I was trying to think of that had that same sound. Have this abrasiveness, but it's still melodic, and it's still like, I think because it's so it's not distorted in a way that you would normally think of distortion. It's this weird whatever distortion pedal that he's using. It's so refined, and so I don't know if it's like compression on it or something like that, but there's just like so much space, but yet the instruments are taking up their sound huge, that it creates this like really unique combination of industrial but still being human and post-punk, and there's all these sorts of weird things going on. You can hear all these weird influences of like, Wire and the Melvins and Minutemen and all these like cool weird sounds going on, just created by these three guys, and these oddly, these very odd instruments that they've chosen. And I just appreciated the fact that, this is heavy, but without being, I don't know, like heavy in that like sludgy sense. It's, I think because the bass is pretty like MIDI, the mid-rangey. It's not like thunderous and like real deep sounding. There's just like this perfect combination of what each instrument sounds, and it helps to have a really great producer in the band who's able to get all of the sounds out of these bands and get them to work, or all the sounds out of these instruments and get them to work in harmony that way. And I like the fact that they pay no attention whatsoever to traditional songwriting. They will ride one verse, but do subtle shifts within that for an entire song. And most of these songs are actually fairly short. You're talking about stuff that's in the, as short as 2 minutes and 20 seconds until really the last song's like over 5 minutes, but that's it. I mean, most of them are in like the 2.5 to 4.5 minute range. Yeah. And they're pretty compact. Some of the songs only have like one or two parts. They just do a lot of subtle shifts within those parts, the way that the rhythm plays, the way that whether the bass is distorted or not, or sometimes they, I'm guessing it's Albini, sometimes we'll switch to like a kind of a lead kind of sound for some of the songs. I guess I guess I covered two things there. One is I like that their complete lack of like traditional songwriting approach, which makes it sound really refreshing. And then the other thing is the fact that it's abrasive yet accessible. I don't know if that's the word. There's no entry point to this band that I could think of on this record where I could go, someone who listens to just regular rock and roll, I'm like, well, here's the band that'll draw you in, or here's the song that'll draw you in.
Yeah.
But if you're a fan of like At the Drive-In,
yeah,
I could clearly see the connection where you'd be like, this is a bit less melodic and a bit less, punk than At the Drive-In, but there's a clear line to this band.
Yeah, that was probably my point of familiarity. Was made aware of this band about the time I got in at the Drive-In, so that was the thing I latched onto at first, and that mostly had to do with sort of the vocal delivery on some of the songs. This is definitely a lower, I don't want to say lower energy. It's a little bit more plotting and deliberate, and a little, it's not as up tempo and fast paced as At the Drive-In can be at times.
Mm-hmm.
They construct movements and create kind of phrases that they play off of, and that's how they build the songs, which is an interesting concept. So they forego, traditional verse chorus to more of a, I don't know, probably closer to like a classical music approach in terms of, you're constructing themes and then you play off of those themes in different ways, and then you create a new one that relates to the previous one. And there's, crescendos, and they don't get real quiet, but there are some quieter parts. Dynamically, I think the drums probably provide most of the dynamic in terms of what instrument they play off of and what role they play. If they're breaking down or locked up at the bass or cut time or what have you. It seems like the drums in a lot of ways are providing that dynamic. What did you think about the vocals throughout the record?
The vocals to me are probably the weakest link. It's not that they're bad. It's just that it's that sort of like shouty style is not necessarily my favorite. There's just not a lot of personality to it. Just sort of a person yelling or sort of growling, I guess, over whatever parts there are. There's actually not a lot of vocals. I mean, there's a couple of instrumental songs on the record, and then there's a couple songs like you mentioned the opening track, My Black Ass. It has a long intro part where there's no vocals at all. And there's quite a few songs that have large spaces without any vocals, or just one sort of line for the entire song, or one or two lines. So it almost is, I don't want to say irrelevant, but that was the least interesting part of the band for me.
I like the vocals more than you did, and it's actually interesting when I revisit the record now that I think I was drawn more to the instrumental portions previously, and now when I listen to it, I'm actually drawn more to the vocal portions, and even the songs in the middle of the record, songs 5, 6, and 7, Songs of Minerals, A Minute, and The Idea of North. I really listen to those tunes in general. They seem way more vocally oriented. Like the vocal isn't just a tacked on piece, which I think in some of the other stuff that you talked about, it almost, it really feels like the vocal was just kind of stuck on, kind of inconsequential. Like some of the songs would be fine without it. But I was actually drawn to that portion of the record where the vocals definitely felt like it was a bigger part of the song, and the band was kind of playing off of it more. In Songs of the Minerals, it's actually very intertwined between the bass and the drums, and at one point, the guitar and the bass. And at one point, the guitar riff starts to mimic the vocal melody, which is, I think probably the only part of the album where something like that happens, and I really enjoyed that. it felt a lot more integrated, and the vocal, I think, fit and had a place much better when things were oriented around it more. Certainly the quality of the vocal and the delivery of it, it's a particular taste, and I'm sure some people wouldn't be, pulled in by it or impressed by it. But if you don't mind it or are used to it, I guess, I felt like there was it's underserved, to be short about it, I guess. Could have played maybe a bigger role than it did.
Well, I felt like a song like A Minute, track 6, the vocal's fine. It just felt like it could have been any sort of throwaway line. Like it doesn't even come in until like a minute and a half into the song, and it's pretty much paired up exactly with like he's singing to the rhythm of the song, and it just feels like it could have been anything that he was singing. Like it didn't really matter what the words were. The cadence was just matching the rhythm of the track.
Yeah, it's kind of hooky though. I don't know. It's like
it's not bad.
It does play off the guitar, but it's still like, I don't know. I found myself kind of getting into it, the way it repeats and kind of pulls you in, and I mean, at no point does it really do anything different. Like it doesn't ever, come at the song from a completely different angle that you weren't expecting. But I guess I just found it, if they were going to have it, to be better integrated with the song. And I felt like those three were good examples of when it is more integrated than some of the others where it's definitely just kind of on top.
See, like on a song like Dog and Pony Show, I felt like, even though that felt really, I don't know, not familiar per se, but it sounded like when we listened to, not like Tad, probably more Melvin's.
Oh, yeah.
That to me felt like a more independent vocal. Like the vocal was a little bit more important to the song than in some of the other tracks. Probably because it was a bit slower and there was more space for the vocal to do things. As opposed to when it's more up tempo, I feel like then the vocal just sort of gets locked in with the rhythm part, like I mentioned with in a minute. It's not. Again, none of the tracks in terms of the vocal are always like, oh, this vocal is killing it for me. It was just like, it kind of just, it didn't matter as much as some of the other ones, like Dog and Pony Show, which I liked a lot.
I actually found a song like Bosha's Dick was a good example. It happens maybe a couple other times on the record where I don't know, the riffs get a little too, I don't know, stereotypical, tuned down, drop tuning riff fest, and it felt a little cheap to me and like didn't work as well. I kind of like when guitar wise it's coming from more of a weird, like a dissonant kind of place, bigger chords that are maybe even a little noisy, but allowing the bass to provide the groove and the melody, and just have this guitar dropping over top with these weird phrases and things to kind of shift the feel of it. When it turned into sort of this locked up riff fest, I was a little less into it. It felt like a song like 9 was a great example of that. Even the last song, they get into that quite a bit, and it's not as interesting to me. It kind of feels like a sloppier version of Helmet or something.
Gotcha.
Know?
Yeah.
It just seemed like I had heard that other places plenty of times, and they weren't offering much in terms of creativity there. I guess one of the last critical things I'll say about the record, that's a very difficult guitar tone to harness and control. There are some times when it sounds really cool and different and has a lot of texture to it. There's other times where it's just harsh and difficult.
Yeah.
So even track 2, like the beginning of that song with the way the guitar sounds there, it's difficult on your ears. I'd be curious to play one of those guitars and kind of mess around with it, but I
was going to ask, are those still for sale? Like, are those currently made, or are those all vintage guitars?
No, you can still get them. They're just,
I imagine they're expensive.
Extremely expensive, yeah.
Like 5-figure expensive or high 4-figure?
I think you're talking probably minimum like $3,000 to $4,000.
Wow,
in that range. There's other companies that make aluminum neck guitars too. I don't know how the tone compares, but I can't imagine it's extremely different. But anyway, it definitely provides a completely different tone for the guitar. But at the same point, it's pretty delicate. It can go from cool to harsh and unlistenable pretty quick. And there's some times on this record where it starts to grate on you, and it's tough to take, especially with the repetition. I mean, this band repeats a lot. And the reason it works usually for me is that they're performing the repetition, so it still has a variety in it, even though they're playing the same riff over and over again at times, because they're actually performing it. There's enough variation in there that it kind of keeps me interested, but it can be a little bit much on your ears.
You mentioned that song, the track 2, Pull the Cup. He's got that like little, that dan-dan-dan-dan riff, which kind of goes through the majority of the song. It's an instrumental song, and it's, but the band sort of changes around him, and that's what keeps it interesting. I mean, he sort of varies the riff a little bit here and there, just in a way that he picks it or whatever he's doing there. I mean, he sometimes emphasizes different aspects of it. And then it's like, 2.5 minutes into the song where it starts to actually change up into something else. But it's about how the other band members sort of come in and then alter their parts around what he's doing, even though that what he's doing is really interesting and cool. And the same thing with track 3, The Admiral. No, not Admiral. Track 4.
Crow.
That's a very like kind of simple song. It's really just based around that guitar and the drum and bass riff. And then he comes in at like the 3-minute mark with that like jagged guitar part. That's, again, it's not really, I mean, he's just kind of like playing 2 notes back and forth for quite a bit of that. And then he goes into like a heavier riff. But it's just like, and he's, it's very simple, but he varies it just enough here and there until he gets to the big riff part. That you can tell that these are guys who had played in bands before and are experienced and know how to like subtly shift a little bit here and there so that you're not just hearing the same thing over and over again, but like allowing, the drums to just subtly change or the bass to subtly change or the guitar to just kind of, so that if one part is the same all the way through, or at least for, the majority of it, the other band members are going to be like, well, we're going to shift this here a little bit and do that. I this is a band that doesn't put out a lot of records. They've only done like 6 or 7 in what I mentioned, like 20 something years, 19 years. So, I don't think that they're hanging around practicing and playing all the time. I think this is kind of like they get together and write a couple songs and make a record. So it's sort of a testament to like, these are good songwriters. Even though when you think of good songwriters, you think of like, pop songwriters. But these are guys who really understand dynamics and keeping you interested throughout an entire track, albeit as abrasive and, non-pop as this is.
Yeah, I would say tracks 2 and 4 really made me feel like being in the band room, like in both good and bad ways. So like good ways, I felt like, this, I totally picture this band, or being in this band and just jamming on this stuff and playing with the phrasings and, setting each other up and, building up and coming in and just all that kind of interplay that you have when you're in a band in a room, just yourselves, nobody's listening, you're just playing for yourselves. I feel like those 2 songs, if you've been in a band, I think you can totally relate to that. As a music reviewer, I'm sitting there like, well, I'm sure a lot of this was really awesome when you're in the room, and especially if you're creating it, but recorded on a disc, some of it falls a little flat, it's missing that context of, it being a record that people are going to listen to without the performance and need to still, keep their interest and move them. So I was conflicted on that part of it. Part of me really liked it. Part of me was a little bit critical of it. But there was certainly, like you were saying, a lot of skill there as players, to do that, to respond to each other and set each other up and play off each other that well.
Let's talk about our ratings for this record. Worthy album, better EP, decent single. I'm going to start, Jay, and I'm going to say that this is a worthy album. I think that this works both as one of those records where I just like to listen to it all the way through, and whether I'm working or mowing the lawn or whatever the hell, I'm doing. But there are certain songs where I would listen to that song and I'd be like, that is just such a cool riff. And I would go back and listen to it again and, try to just like focus in on a particular part of the song. I think it works well in that way too. I don't think there's a lot of fat. I mean, this is it's 10 songs and it doesn't even hit 40 minutes. It's a pretty tight record. They didn't load it up with a lot of junk and a lot of fat. I mean, you could argue that maybe there's a song or here or there that has a little bit too long of an intro. That's fine. But I think for the most part, this is a really, really good record.
Yeah, I think it's a worthy album. I don't think it's a perfect album by any stretch of the imagination, but to your point, I think the weakest parts are some of the repetitions and the setups. They kind of go on a little long, but the element of the performance saves that for me. And it's also the kind of record where, you'll zone out a little bit during those parts, and that's okay, because something's going to grab you and pull you back. You're not going to zone out for the whole song. So it has its flaws, but I think there's enough. There's enough here from a performance standpoint, from a idea standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, to make it worth a listen.
All right. Well, if you have an opinion on this record, please head on over to our Facebook page or digmeoutpodcast.com and chime in. If you think we're crazy that this is a worthy record, let us know. Or if you have more praise you'd like to heap upon it, feel free to do so. And if you like what you heard, please consider leaving us some positive feedback over at iTunes. Of course, you can always suggest an album for us to review by going to digmeoutpodcast.com and hitting up our request a review page. I thank everybody for listening. Jay, I just wanted to divert for 1 second. As we're recording this last week, U2 released a new record for free through iTunes at the big Apple announcement. And they did so by, if you were one of the lucky people, they just put the album into your iTunes and into your players. What'd you think of that?
Well, it's kind of funny. When I heard the announcement, it was complicated to me. Like, I'm trying to understand what they were saying. Like it's available on iTunes. We're giving it to everybody. I'm like, what the hell does that mean? So it was kind of funny to me when I heard it. I had a hard time. I consider myself a pretty savvy person when it comes to this kind of thing, and I didn't understand what the hell they were doing. And then for me as well, that made it weird is that I am one of the apparently few people that is over the 25,000 song limit on iTunes Cloud or Music Match or whatever the hell they call it. What this basically means is my iTunes just doesn't work right. So I've never gotten the record. It doesn't show up in my library. Basically, I've broken my iTunes because I have too many songs in it. And so I can't even get the song to show up if I would want to, which I'd probably listen to it at least once just to hear it. So I can't even get the song. It's not in my library on any of my devices. But outside of my personal experience, I think they would have been better off just to make it free in the store, and just let people who wanted it to go click the button and they would appear. I think it's kind of funny that so many people seem to get upset by it because it's not on your device. It's in the cloud. It's just available for you to play if you choose to.
Right.
So it's not like they downloaded, hundreds of megabytes of files onto your phone or something. It's just you can access it. So that part of it I found kind of funny for the people that got upset about it. But yeah, I mean, I think it could have been done better, but it was an interesting concept. I don't think they'll be doing it again anytime soon.
Do you think that they did it this way because they know they made a weak record?
I just think they're trying to be relevant. I don't know. I can't say if the quality of the record or not. I think they're trying to be relevant, and this got them in the news, and just releasing the record in a normal way wouldn't have done that. Also, they can say, regardless of how it sells, they can say it was the largest release ever or whatever. You know what I mean? They're always going to have that sort of PR angle to take with it.
Right.
So it kind of makes sales of the record almost irrelevant when they actually do start selling it in a month or so, whenever they're going to do that. But I don't know. I guess that's possible, but I didn't read it that way. Have you listened to it?
I have not listened to it. I've read a couple reviews. Rolling Stone gave it a 5 out of 5 glowing review. And the other reviews that I've read on Stereo Gum and I think Consequence of Sound and some other blogs were pretty harsh. That this was basically a possibly one of the worst albums that they've made. Just complete lack of any memorable choruses, and Just a totally like studio sounding, no life to it, kind of bland production, just overly done in the studio with killed all the sort of life in the songs. And I thought of it at first like, oh, this is interesting, I can go get this record. And then when I found out that like it was actually just populating in people's iTunes,
right,
I was like, well, that's kind of weird because not everybody listens to U2.
Yeah, you were on the same page as I was. Is that, oh, it's cool, I can go download this, or I can, you don't download it, but you can purchase it or add it or however you want to phrase it. And
Right.
then when I started to realize that's not what it was doing, they're basically buying it for you because it shows up as purchased in your account. They're just not charging you for it. That part was weird, and I think confusing for people. Confusing for people who want the record and confusing for people who don't.
Right.
So that was probably, but I think the reason they did that is that way they could say, they could, claim all those devices that it's available on as being released to. They wouldn't have done that. That number wouldn't have been as big. So I'm guessing it was something U2 wanted to do, to have that claim,
Well, reportedly they made like $100 million on this deal. So
yeah, and obviously Apple prepaid for everything.
Yeah.
So I thought the single was, from what I've heard of it, it seemed, I don't know, it seemed like classic U2 with I guess a little modern edge with how that riff sounds, but I thought there was portions of it that kind of reminded me of, a classic U2 sound. But I don't know. That was the one single that doesn't really, the rest of the record could be a turd. And I'm no U2 expert. I don't know the last time I listened to a whole U2 record.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I don't know that I really like the couple they put out as either.
Yeah, they haven't been real relevant as a modern force in music.
Yeah.
Their spot got taken over by Coldplay.
I do like that we got to try some different stuff. I'm tired of, I'm not going to try to stop myself from going on a rant here, but I'm tired of like Gene Simmons and people like that who every time they get a mic and start talking about album sales because their recent records stink and nobody's bought them, and they start blaming file sharing and subscription services the reason why the music business is in the crapper. I'm so sick of hearing that. It's like, things have changed, deal with it. Music's radio and MTV no longer are relevant, so people have to be made aware of records in some new way.
Right.
And we haven't figured out what that way is yet. So right now, basically, the remaining people who still listen to the radio, it's really just generic pop music at this point. All other genres have been killed in terms of, radio as a discovery. MTV doesn't play music. So how does stuff break? YouTube is like kind of a way to do it, but that's even, who curates, YouTube? Who are the people deciding like what the good shit is on YouTube? So there's kind of this big void that is yet to be filled, and I'm glad to see. I'm sure this thing won't happen again, but shit, I'm just glad to see people thinking of new ideas. And some are going to work and some aren't. But geez, if we all just sit around and whine about file sharing and subscription services killing the music business, we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, file sharing is the de facto excuse for
it's
anybody
lazy.
who is no longer relevant, explaining their album sales has dropped off.
Right. It's lazy. It's ridiculous. But for the Kiss thing, unless we've all asked a statement on this, but the hilarious part of that is that I became a Kiss fan based on dubbed cassettes from friends and hand-me-down vinyl records from my brothers. Mm-hmm. I didn't buy a Kiss record until I was probably almost 20, or maybe a teenager. But I started listening to them when I was 5 or 6 years old, and I wasn't going out and buying the records at that age. They were given to me for free. I was file sharing them, and I'm sure the vast majority of Kiss fans discovered the band through some free means. They didn't go out the first time and buy a record with their own money. It's just like completely it's just intellectually dishonest, like not a way, completely void of reality and facts. So anyway, I'm glad they tried something new. It was kind of goofy. Lesson learned, I think.
Yes, lesson learned. All right, folks, we're out. Thanks for listening. Next week we're going to be doing. I think next week is we're going to be doing Corey Glover's album, which is the lead singer of Living Colour. He had a solo album out in the 90s.
Danny Glover?
Danny Glover. Murtaugh. And Corey Glover.
We have to watch all the Lethal Weapons this week?
Yes. So get your Joe Pesci and your Chris Rock ready. And is it Chris Rock? Is that who's in? Is he in?
Yeah, he might be in one. I get those mixed up with.
He's like the sidekick, right, in one of those movies.
I think he appears in one. Yeah.
God, I hope I'm right, or else I'm going to sound like an idiot. But they like added a sidekick
like
each
Chris
movie,
Tucker
so like, yeah, like after the first one and like the second one isn't like Joe Pesci the sidekick, and then in the third one, it's like,
I want to say like, isn't there 4 of them or 5?
There's 4 or 5.
After the second one, I feel like they started introducing sidekicks in every subsequent one, and I thought Chris Rock was a sidekick in one of them.
Yeah,
I'll have to look that up.
And then like Cousin Oliver shows up in the 5th one, and then they reboot it with younger versions, and yeah. So no, Corey Glover, lead singer of Living Colour. We're going to be doing his first solo record, Hymns, which came out in the late 90s, and that's on tap for next week. So if you have an opinion on that, make sure to get it in soon. That's it. For Jay, I'm Tim. We're out. We'll be back next week with another episode. Dig me out.
Join the conversation about this episode at digmeoutpodcast.com, where you can find links to our Facebook page and Twitter feed, as well as links to our request a review and merchandise pages.